Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so excited to be able to bring my colleagues and friends together for this conversation, thinking about what are the problems we tend to associate with machine learning and how can we perhaps rethink what machine learning's core questions are. And specifically, how do we push questions of social justice and equity to the forefront we take on in this discipline. And I'm going to ask the panelists to actually introduce themselves, just so you understand the flow of the event. We'll take a little bit of time, just a small amount at the beginning, so I can ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and their work, just to set up the questions that they're currently asking. And then we'll move into some more structured discussion. Hopefully, we'll see some places where we disagree politely, of course, or maybe not so much. And then we'll leave as much time as we can, hopefully 15 minutes at the end, and I'll be joined by my colleague and co-worker at the Microsoft Research New England lab, Kevin Yang, who's a computational biologist. I should say my name is Mary Gray. I'm a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research New England. I'm an anthropologist and media scholar by training. So I joined Microsoft Research with in a very particular moment, but with a vision that qualitative, critical social sciences would be able to take part in shaping the questions of computer science and engineering. And I'm on faculty at Indiana University in the School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering. With me today, I'll say briefly, Rediat is going to be joining the faculty at UC Berkeley. Irene is already at Stanford on faculty, and Augustine is on faculty at Columbia University. So we're all colleagues here who want to get into the thick of this conversation. So with that, I'd like to ask Rediat if you'd begin, please.
Yes, I'd be happy to. Hello, how's it going? You guys are good, very good. All right. Hello to everyone else out there that I don't see, but thank you for tuning in. I'm Rediat Abebe. As Mary said, I'm currently a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows and starting at UC Berkeley in the computer science department in fall 2021. My research area is broadly in the field of sort of algorithms and AI. So I use a lot of techniques from economics and computation, social networks, and also data-driven approaches. And my main focus really is, okay, so we have this kind of bag of like techniques that we use and develop, but really my main focus is thinking about how those can help with questions related to justice and equity. And in particular, I've been really invested in and working in questions related to poverty and inequality, questions related to sort of access to information, especially in health contexts, and then also stepping back and thinking about the limitations of algorithms in these sort of real world contexts, like how do we set constraints around, some desired criteria that we might have, let's say fairness. What impact does the objective function have? How do we set these objective functions when we have these algorithms? Also thinking about explainability, right? Because a lot of times the algorithms that we develop actually end up getting implemented directly in practice to allocate, scarce societal resources and public goods like schools and, organs that are life-saving and things like that. And yet there's a sort of lack of explainability aspect to them. So I kind of think about this whole bag of things. I consider myself a computer scientist. I when someone calls me a machine learning person, I'm not upset, although I don't know that I actively kind of use that. I say AI sometimes, but what I'm really interested in is actually just sort of like this investment in a specific domain and seeing what our techniques have to add to that domain and to learn from those domains.
Thank you very much. Irene, could I ask you to go next? Tell us if you identify as a machine learning scholar.
Sure. So my name is Irene Lowe. I'm an assistant professor in management science and engineering at Stanford University. So my PhD is actually in operations research, which I guess is not exactly the same discipline as computer science, but I think there are some connections, and I'll try to help draw some connections during today's panel. I work on the design of matching and allocation algorithms, mostly from a theoretical perspective, but also with an eye to really getting them implemented in ways that are solving and addressing issues in the settings that these algorithms are being deployed. Some of the areas that I care about are particularly in nonprofit and public sector allocation settings, like in education, the developing world, supply chains for food. And I really care about these applications because I think we're in a privileged position in academia and research where we can really think deeply about these problems and try to understand the problems and try to help in designing solutions to them. And yeah, when you're actually on the ground in these kinds of applications, often you don't have the luxury of being able to sit back and think, okay, what is the root source of the problem? What kind of new techniques can I develop to help address this? So that's why I really care about this area as a researcher. And one of the areas that I've been working on is school assignment. And here I've been working with the San Francisco Unified School District to redesign their student assignment system. That's one of my big projects right now. And there I've also been learning a lot about how the setup of this algorithmic system that's used to assign students interacts with, the setting, which is, well, as computer scientists, we might come in with a bunch of assumptions like, oh, the algorithm just takes as input preferences. So we're going to assume that people know and can truthfully report their preferences, which is obviously a terrible assumption, but that's just something we come in and we assume in theoretical work. So thinking about, well, how can we bridge this assumption from the algorithmic framework that we're using as researchers, and then the actual application area. Yeah, there's a bunch of other interesting questions here, which I won't get into, but here's just one of them. Yeah, and so just to sum up, I have really been learning over the past few years how we can, as academics, be engaging in end-to-end work, whether that's actually engaging in problem identification, engaging in objective definition, engaging in co-designing solutions and co-deploying them, and thinking about, is my technical expertise actually relevant or useful here? Yeah, and so from that perspective, I think even though I don't personally identify as a machine learning researcher, I think some of my learnings might be interesting for all of you.
Thank you. Thank you. So Augustine, please introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you. So at the beginning, I want to preface by perhaps correcting a perception. I'm sort of, among the panelists, the person that seems the oldest, but I just want to sort of put this in perspective that I've been working in research for 22 years, and I've actually, part of that relate to some of the topics we're going to discuss during this panel. I've been personally actually working on, making our field slightly more diverse and equal, mostly focused on gender diversity for a few years. A few things I can report on that. And I literally just, worked on racial equity for maybe a week or months, maybe if you want to be very generous, when I really started understanding the importance of those issues. So since the panel is going to describe how we as a community and we as a researcher and as an individual, we can sort of be part of the solution, I just want to acknowledge that I'm the youngest in definitely by experience and learning, and that is, I'm really here to sort of complement what Rediet, Irene, and Maria have already brought for much more years in thinking broadly about those problems. I want to say that, my experience just, understanding how much we are within the social context on which we have a responsibility has really changed my research, and also changed retrospectively the meaning of what I've done before. So to quickly sort of summarize, what I've been involved at Columbia was working on things that relates perhaps a lot to machine learning in the way it affects various domains. So one of the domains on which that started was journalism. We have a journalism school at Columbia. Those people are usually the first responder when data are being abused and badly used. And they are the one watching the big tech. They are the one, trying to understand what's going behind closed doors in the algorithm. So some of the work I've done was, producing transparency algorithms that help understand discrimination in online ads, for instance. It moved on to, understanding the structure of computational social network, which has been, my research for decades now, and understanding how those structures create, structural handicaps, structural reasons that sort of, are going to persistently and repeatedly disadvantage particular groups. And so that's part of my research that we've been working on. And more recently, as in general, we worked on understanding how AI today, basically AI is everything. We dovetail into lots of different domains in my lab and collaborators working on mental health and location data and how this app you're seeing to diagnose your mental wellness and all of that, are they really affecting? Are they really helping everybody equally? We worked also on understanding other domains that I can talk about, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion we have about how to make the field better.
So one of the questions that I have, and certainly everybody in the audience likely has an understanding of, like, how do we define what's core to machine learning? But Augustine, maybe I could ask you to just tee up, what is the existing approach to machine learning? Like, how does it identify its problems? How does it think about its kind of core, its tasting questions? Could you just lay that out a little bit?
Sure. I'm happy to sort of report some years working on that. So if I want to be sort of, giving you the dynamic view, I would say there are some familiar traditional paradigm to defining problem in machine learning. One of them is to take the problem that was defined before and improve the method, and that has been a lot of work. Another one is to say, well, we have this new tool that is meant to be general and has actually been successful in a few domains. How can we branch that to another field? That for a while, machine learning was essentially taking this idea that data have been extracted, the tools have been designed, but it doesn't really fit the feature or the particular type of phenomenon we're trying to understand. How do we, make this translation? And that has been heavily, I would say, designed by, the machine learning researcher trying to find how do you find the way that the problem can be finally translatable to a machine. That was what has been done a lot. This is more like, I would say, what you would describe machine learning maybe 5-7 years ago, and a lot of it is still being done like that. I see that being transformed today for two reasons. One of them is that there are new problems that are honestly just fundamentally changing even the assumption about what it is to make in the model things that relate to fairness and justice and equity. And as I said, more other people on the panel can talk better than me about that. And the second thing is also the fact that initially there was a little bit this inspiration from scientific research that we are only observers and we will then get data and be able to interpret them. But now we are almost always intervening on the system we're trying to study. And when you do that, there's basically no way to use the traditional statistic toolbox. You need to look at causal effects. You need to look at other type of model. And those models basically don't provide scientific knowledge without domain expertise. And I know there's an next panel working on causality after that will explore that. But I think those two things right now are really redefining how do we define the problem from just a pure paradigm viewpoint. And I think the third thing that is very important is that more and more people in our conferences, in our lab, in the undergrad student taking our classes that want to have an impact in the world with our tools, more and more we have to create bridges so that the domain expert and the affected population are part of the overall sort of data science pipeline. And that's something in which I've seen a little bit of a revolution in education on putting that forward to the curriculum, at least the sort of cooking up.
So I want to pick up the way you just described machine learning and its approach, and ask Irene and Reddy, whoever might want to go take on this question. The way I got to know your work, I feel so fortunate because we shared a lab for parts of our careers, was through the mechanism designed for social good. So that workshop, which you all just, turned into a thing and now is going to become an ACM sponsored workshop. It seems like in some ways that workshop is the opposite of the approach that I just heard Augustine describe. So maybe Irene, because already it might be frozen. Irene, if you could just talk a little bit about the formation of the mechanism design for social good as a workshop and where you see it connecting with these, the shift that Augustine was just describing for ML taking up these questions. And particularly, you said in your introduction, you think of your work as thinking about, the defining of a problem, identifying objective functions that are going to matter, and then co-designing a solution. And I'm really intrigued by that model because it sounds like you do start with the problem first. So yeah, just walk us through how you're thinking about problems.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that question. And thank you also for mentioning mechanism design for social good. I should give credit where it's due. Rediet and Kira Goldner were actually the co-founders of Mechanism Design for Social Good. And it started as a reading group that grew out of the economics and computation community, another community that takes this approach of starting with hammers. We have these various methodological and theoretical tools that we become experts in during our PhD and in our research. And then we go out looking for applications that these tools might be helpful in addressing. And Radiant and Kira had a very basic question. They asked, why are so many of these tools being used for-profit applications? Like a big one is ads.
Oh, okay, gotcha. I was about to ask you, what's a concrete example of where this happened? So yeah, can you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think there was a time in the history of the economics and computation community where 50% majority of papers were looking at the design of ad auctions because these are sort of, my interpretation of this is that these are the big money makers for a lot of these big platforms. And there are lots of very interesting technical questions that come in when you start thinking about how to design all different kinds of complicated ad auctions. And so there was both, support from companies to do this research, and also really interesting mathematical questions that were as part of this research. And that combination was enough to sort of drive the community into really fixating on this one area. And so Mechanism Design for Social Good asked, well, actually, with these same tools, there are a lot of other really important questions. Like I've been working on school assignment and also developing world markets. Reddit's been working on housing allocation. These applications are really natural places to apply these kinds of tools. So in Mechanism Design for Social Good, exactly as you said, Mary, we decided to flip the model on its head. Let's start from the problem. We set up, Reddit and Kira set up these 3-week modules where we did deep dives into different domains like inequality, healthcare, education, looked at examples of existing work from our community which had connections to those domains, and tried to understand, okay, is our work, what we know, actually appropriate and relevant for questions in these domains? If so, which questions, and how can we go and learn more? And that's sort of how Mechanism Design for Social Good began, as a very humble reading group of people who were interested in learning more. And since then, we've really grown into this really fantastic community that still starts from the problem and asks, given the problem, what kinds of people should be involved in trying to tackle it, who should be in the conversations, and then which algorithmic techniques do we think are the most appropriate.
Can I ask each of you, and maybe you could start, but can I ask each of you, take a particular problem you're working on right now that you've flipped, and walk us through kind of the alternative paths. Like if you were taking this problem, how would ML have tackled this problem, and how have you changed the approach? And I think particularly I'm interested in the way Irene just described, thinking about something like school assignment. I see, and moving things away from advertising, optimizing advertising. I absolutely see parallels in a conversation in ML around, say, image recognition. And what are the applications of image recognition? What is it that's valued, maybe implicitly, that feels like it's just kind of a generic problem, but actually implicitly cares about something that isn't really discussed. So with that preface, like I'm really curious, like walk us through what it looks like to do things differently, to kind of start with the problem. What does that mean?
That's a really great question. It sounds like I was frozen earlier. Let me know if it ends up being frozen and I'll maybe move closer. Okay, very good. I do want to answer your question, Mary, but I also wanted to follow up on what Irene said and also what Augustine said. I think that a common theme that I'm hearing is that there's issues of power, there's issues of friction, and there's issues of representation, right? Because Mary, you asked us, what is sort of like core ML, who gets to be included in part of the core ML, right? And when I think about it, I'm just like, in other fields, I don't think you have that in the same way, like what is core X, where X is some other field. You don't really have that in the same way. And I think the reason why we have it is for the same reason that, if a student wants to get a job, we're like, hey, you should probably take an ML class or a data science class, include that in your CV. Like people will just value that, right? And so there is actually a concentration of power around machine learning, and that concentration of power is driven by a lot of large corporations. And I think if we can't openly talk about that, we're probably not going to make that much progress, right? Because to me, it's sort of like, who really cares, what's core ML and what's not core ML? Just work on stuff that you find interesting, talk to people who are interested in the same things. If it ends up being labeled ML, that's great. If not, then that's also fine, right? And so I think that that's something we should talk about. And the second thing is issues of friction. Irene was mentioning that, the EC community, the economics and computation community, especially in the beginning, had a very kind of close set of relationships with those that would care, say, about ad auctions, among other problems. And part of it is because, you're a PhD student. Actually, this is like a true story. This happened to me, right? I was a PhD student, my first year, and I continue to have, and I had a burning passion towards addressing issues of inequality and injustice. And I went to my advisor and I said, hey, I really want to work on this. And he's like, you should go do an internship. And I said, okay, where do I do an internship? And he's like, well, my students have gone and done internships at these corporations, right? And I was like, okay, maybe I'll do that, but actually let me go off and see what other opportunities there are. And I spent like at least a month, like really emailing everyone I could think of, really just like poking around to see whether there was a place where I could spend a summer and try to engage with problems that are related to poverty and inequality. It didn't really work. I ended up at MSRNE. I met you. I worked with Nicole. There's, an awesome set of things happen. And so it was a summer well spent. But I do think about that, right? Like I do think about how many students are by default just kind of like, they finish undergrad and they're like, okay, I need to get a job. I guess I'll go work for, wherever, right? Because those paths are very easy to follow. And then our relationship with policy and, nonprofits and other types of work are not so, sort of that link is not so strong. And I think we really need to work on that. And the third thing is issues of representation, right? So to me, I was born and raised in Ethiopia. I'm a Black woman. I'm an immigrant. I grew up low income. There are all these things that kind of inform my day to day. And so, when I arrived to Cambridge, Massachusetts as an undergrad, and I went to public school committee meetings, and I learned about how Black and Latinx and low income and first generation and students with disabilities, like all these students are performing 2 to 4 grades below their level. This to me felt personal, right? I deeply cared about this. This kind of felt incredibly urgent and pressing to me. So it's not surprising that because of that, I do the kind of research that I do. Right. And so I think if a whole community is not really if a whole research community is not really representative of the rest of society, it's unsurprising that there will be sort of like correlated preferences, correlated sort of like things that you think are urgent, correlated interests, right? I think that's something that does shape how we kind of evolve as a community, and we really have to think about that. So I did want to mention each of these things. I know I've gone for a bit longer, but I'll say a quick thing for your question, Mary. So one of the things that I'm doing right now is I'm working with folks in Ethiopia, but also folks at the Ethiopian Ministry of Education, where they're restructuring the matching process for students for entering public universities, so similar to what Irene is doing. And so they kind of approached us, and we started conversations with them. And it was so interesting to me how, I came in and I was like, I know all the matching, let's do it. I know matching, right? We can do stuff. And then they started telling us all the sort of practical challenges. And you're like, yikes, what a nightmare. And also just like not like a fun research problem, but incredibly important, right? So there's that. But I think if you're in a domain, you do the fun stuff and you do the not so fun stuff. Okay, like that's just what you are. But the other thing that's been amazing is actually when we were talking to them, they said, hey, we've had these matching mechanisms before, and they work okay, we think, but a lot of students come back and they say, I don't like my match. And so then we have to go through this whole appeal process, and that's incredibly like energy and time and resource consuming for us. We really don't like that. And so if it's possible, when you have these matching mechanisms, could you let people know why they didn't get their, if you get your third choice, why didn't you get your first or second choice? And I remember when I heard this question, I was like, oh my God, right? What an awesome research direction. I don't think they realized it as a research direction, but it is. We haven't actually thought about explainability and mechanism design as much as we should. And it's a space where we do get to like design exactly what the mechanism is. And so you'd think that there's actually more hope in explaining things than say in like kind of black box machine learning algorithms, right? And so I think if you create these relationships, right, then you get like a bag of stuff. Some of it will be like mundane things that you have to do. It's not going to be so fun. Some of it will be like kind of interesting. And then others might be like sort of these transformative questions that you're like, this is amazing. And I'm so grateful that I had this conversation with them. And I'll conclude really quickly by saying that I think in doing these, in kind of starting these relationships, I think it's important to think about like, I think, Mary, you called it mutuality. I think that's a really great word for it. I was thinking of it as a sort of equal partnership and trust-based system. You really shouldn't be doing it as like a one-off thing. It shouldn't be sort of very opportunistic. I think you should genuinely be invested in what's going on and trying to sort of really thinking of it as like serving that community rather than like, I have my research questions and I got to get, I guess, tenure, the next thing I have to worry about. I got to get tenure. So, I'm going to like, you really have to think about it. I think that's incredibly important.
Jump in here, Irene, because I could see, I know this really resonates with how you're approaching your questions too.
Yeah, maybe I'll use the example of the San Francisco School District work. In some ways, it's quite similar to Reddit. You go in, so actually we started working with them because they had said that they were going to redesign their system. And so we said, hey, we know something about school choice systems, maybe we can help. And the process has been a lot like Reddit described. You learn about all the logistical constraints and like all these issues that you run into. They're just like, we assume them all away in theory, right? We come in, we say, here's our model of the world. Students know their preferences. They all arrive at the same point in time. They all like rationally understand how the system works and interact with it in a certain way. And yeah, we were just assuming away a lot of the problems that were really important on the ground. And so, yeah, that was one thing that I've been learning. Another thing is that we come in also with predefined objectives. So we came in, we said, okay, maybe stable matching is the way to go. Like, that's what the literature says, it must be right. It's also strategy proof. We can use this wonderful algorithm. Great. And they said, well, actually, here are the objectives that the board has defined for us. They are diversity, proximity, predictability, and equity of access. We don't have measures for these yet. Maybe you can help us with that too. And yeah, we don't really know how this all interacts with an algorithm. Can you help make it understandable and interpretable for us? And we kind of looked at that and said, ooh, like 90% of this is not what we typically be doing in research. But we still, engaged. We brought on more people on the team. We really wanted to engage in these questions. And in the process, I've been sort of involved in this back and forth, defining objectives or proxies for objectives, thinking, is this actually, if this is what you want, from a technical perspective, how should I think about this thing you want? Maybe you think of it as an objective, but it's easier for me to model it as this kind of constraint on quotas. Is that okay with you? If it's not, let's talk through why that's not okay. So we have weekly meetings where we basically just hash these out over and over. And yeah, we basically haven't done any research with them yet. But as Reddit mentioned, we've had so many potential interesting research questions that have come out of these conversations.
I am dying to push back on both of you have said. This is not real research.
I was about to say that.
Okay, and I want to understand that because I think that is very much to the heart of this panel, is that right now that's seen as, why doesn't that count? What is it that keeps that from counting as, and it's a genuine question. In some ways I could be devil's advocate and say, well, how can ML help if this isn't, about optimizing a benchmark? So help me understand, why is this considered kind of auxiliary or,
Maybe I can say this first, and I can also say in the context of my field, which is not ML, so someone else can sort of jump in for the ML structure. But I think in my area, which is operations research, there's this just historically this view that in order to have really great research, there has to be a novel technical component.
Can you say exactly what you mean by that? I'm going to be the person who's I don't know what you mean. What do you mean?
So I mean that I'm working with these algorithms. A big part of the work I'm doing now is trying to understand how do I massage what's been given to me from the context into something that the algorithm understands. How do I define an objective? And that process right now is just not part of academic discourse, right? The assumption we come in is that this is the kind of input you get to your algorithm, and designing the algorithm to suit certain kinds of input is what's counted as technical research. And so in that sense, what I'm doing right now with all this objective definition and these sort of heuristics and proxies is not viewed as technical research. Now, I do want to say that in the economics and computation community in EC, there has been in the past few conferences this applied modeling track, which looks a lot more like what I'm currently doing, which is, okay, here's a problem, here are the tools. It takes a really long time to properly define the problem. And this work is called modeling, and we should actually recognize it. And so I think we're starting to make some headway, at least in the EC community, to recognizing this research, but this is all very, very recent.
So is it fair to say that part of your secret sauce, and Augustine, I want to bring you in here, that if it is starting with the problem, you're saying understanding the problem in this really much more nuanced, complicated, really embracing the noise is a part of your research. It's a part of what lets you address these social questions. Is that fair to say? And Augustine, do you want to jump in here?
I think I can shortly speak to that and also answer the previous question you had about giving examples on how to do things differently. So the traditional way is, you got data from some public data set or some person who contacts you and has something interesting, and you extract using traditional methods some new knowledge. And we've been all guilty of that. That's fine. That goes fast. You publish quickly and you move on. What's not that, the two things that I've experienced are sometimes you define a problem and it basically resists the method you have, and that leads you to redefine it in a new way. And sometimes, in the best case, find new theoretical problems. So an example I had with online recommendation was that we are understanding that female received less attention on lots of social network. I'm not going to name the one we looked at, but it's not in anything special. And then we were wondering why algorithm reinforced that, and we couldn't really find it through the usual tools we had. We had to basically go back, understand the mechanism of homophily and growth that are connected to social networks. So essentially go back and have a kind of theory of the social network growth to kind of understand where it comes from and what caused the amplification, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to differentiate what is organic bias from algorithmic bias. And so the fact that we had to go a little deeper than using general fairness condition was one thing that led that. In those cases, usually our community welcomes that because you come back with a new theoretical problem somehow. You have excel at changing the method, you made it sort of further, and people appreciate that. And then there's the third kind of project, and this one I have to say is relatively ungratifying, where you're actually trying to measure the gap between what we have right now and what the actual problem is. So I'm going to give you an example. I could have three, but I'm going to use one. We wanted to understand, we have all this fairness machine learning toolkit. They are actually progressing somehow, to bring some tools to address some bias in, let's say, the training data. So we took a canonical example where the tool exists, we know how to fix it. A particular data set is biased because some particular population was undersampled in a particular reason. We gave that to a bunch of machine learning coder researchers that we could recruit, and we give to some of them access to those tools, and we are trying to see what are the codes they produce. Because there's a lot of other reasons why it doesn't work, like people don't necessarily see it, or they are in a rush, so we wanted to sort of do an end-to-end experiment. Does it actually work to provide the tool to people? We found that giving people a hint that fairness is part of the objective, it's one of the things we want, do have an effect. On the other hand, providing them with a technical solution, it can be counterproductive. Like the actual algorithm you have is less fair, and we are wondering why. And that came from the fact that people forced an actual algorithm that was perhaps extracting more signal into something that resembled what we were describing, and that was actually worse than even the things they would spontaneously do. So that was an example where we kind of learn how far we are from really answering the problem. Not to discredit what has been done, but just also to do that. So when you do that, it's true, it's fair to say that those paper gets a little bit, they are appreciated perhaps after the fact, or but it's usually a little bit more of a negative result that is, the lack of those tools. And another example we had was related to predicting mental health from mobility. There's a lot of papers saying using basically student population that you could sort of do that. And we were trying to understand if that's true. And that, again, the gap is extremely far if you look at large data set and things like that. So, but those results are here. I think they're very important to do. And I think we just have to sort of, we need to have a thick skin. If I had a PhD student who asked me, I really want to do that, I don't want to do the traditional, I'll be like, well, don't spend your entire PhD on that, but you are right that part of your PhD, it's a multi-year commitment, should be to pose those questions. If you're not even trying, if you're going over, multiplying paper after paper, you're probably going to be seen as relatively shallow in, some tool exists, I apply them, some tool exists, I apply them. That's not going to really shine to people. So that usually is the only incentives you have to tell people that there's a novelty that you will get through there.
So I want to circle back to this question of incentives, because I think it seems really, really important. Before we go there, because we have just about 5 minutes, a little more than 5 minutes left for our conversation, before I'd like to ask my colleague Kevin Yang to join us and bring we're getting some really great questions from the folks watching. The question I have for you is, it sounds like the way you approach your problems, you're dependent on domain expertise that's outside of your training. So even thinking about the beginning of your workshop, you're doing reading groups, and in many ways there are folks out there that have such deep, years, decades, and training in those research problems, say like systemic racism. We could go on. So talk to me about what it looks like, or what it could look like, to bring domain expertise to the table for these questions, and how it would complement and connect to ML. Like, who do you need at the table? Who's missing? How do we get them there? Ready? Why don't I pick on you to get us going?
I can jump in. Yeah. So I think the way I think about it is that actually the tables are there. They're just like other tables that we haven't been a part of. That's how I've thought about it. So in my case, when I did my PhD at Cornell, I had an opportunity so we had the information science program, which has some sociologists. So I had some proximity to folks like Karen Levy, who was, just down the hall from me. But also across the street, we had the Center for the Study of Inequality in the sociology department. And also econ, although I think I spent more of my time in the sociology department. And so what I did was, and this was not at all incentivized, so we should talk about incentives. What I did was I just took a bunch of like graduate level classes in sociology. I was I did not know what I was doing. I asked like the most basic questions, and it was really, really hard. But I felt like I was drawing so much from the sociological literature that it was actually part of my duty to like do my due diligence, like take the sort of the foundational classes that you would take, and it really helped me. I felt like the worst sociologist that's ever lived, but I felt like I kind of picked up the language, right, and like sort of what a sociologist would think about, and like what questions they might be interested in, how they might tackle it. And I even started a project that was like just a social science project, right? So I learned how to design a survey. It's hard. You would never know if you only took, computer science classes. You would just never know. And it was like the stuff that I'm now realizing that I learned in retrospect. I'm like, that was just like such an obvious thing, and it's kind of like embarrassing that I didn't know. But of course I didn't know. I was not trained, right? And so I think that I don't think every single person has to do this. I think that would be kind of inefficient. It's fine for some folks to just be like, I'm going to push the boundaries of algorithm design, and that's what I'm going to do. I think that's actually even good, not fine. I think that's actually even necessary. But I do think our research community has to have some composition of people who are working towards being multilingual and can help kind of like translate issues from one side to the other. I think that's something that should be valued more. And I wanted to mention, I think in all the answers that we've had, I think there's now this recognition that in how people get hired or promoted or whatever it is, we sort of center like technical contribution, like algorithmic technical contributions in our fields, right? And I think that's such a huge missed opportunity, right? Why would we center algorithms when we can center people, right? Because the algorithms will happen anyway, because people's social processes are very complex. And it's going to force you to actually do really hard math, whether you like it or not, if that's something that you wanted to do. And so to me, it feels like you actually lose more by centering algorithms than by centering people, which was going to force you to do some algorithms anyway. But I think the answer here is the history of the field, right? I think that, and the sort of the structural racism and sexism that we have. We know that many folks just implicitly or explicitly assume that women and queer folks and Black folks and Latinx folks, like we know that these groups of people are assumed to just be less technically competent, right? Whether that's justified or not, it's just assumed, and it happens in kind of the most egregious cases. And so our model that centers technical contributions and algorithms is a sort of indirect way of making sure that we really try to filter those people out as much as possible, right? Like I have 3 graduate degrees. I have 3 master's degrees in math and computer science, and I have a PhD in computer science. I did my undergrad in math. Like this is, I could not have done more math. I've done as much math as anyone should ever have to do. And yet I'm still in these situations where, I would get in conversations and people are like, well, are you an activist? Right? That's a question that I sometimes get. And it's not said as a compliment. And I think that we need to be kind of more honest about these issues of power and how they come to play. I don't think it's out of thin air that we decided to center algorithms in our conversations.
I want to hold up that point. Irene, please go ahead. Yeah,
I wanted to jump in maybe to give to spotlight a few things Radiat had said for the benefit of any graduate students or PhD students who are listening to this panel. So I think one of the things she mentioned was entering into another field and learning its language. And I think this is the #1 thing you can really do if you're a PhD student who wants to be involved in interdisciplinary work. Just go out there, be humble, understand that you're going to look like you don't know anything when you first start, but really, just try to learn the language of different disciplines. And once you learn the language, you'll understand, oh, hey, like other disciplines have really good words for concepts that I didn't know how to formalize before, or other disciplines have different words for a concept that we already have in my discipline, but we use different words, and so we didn't know how to communicate with each other. And I also want to just put a plug here. Microsoft Research was actually the place where I first saw this being part of a research community, people coming together from economics, computer science, social science, and trying to understand each other's language, research language, and then also what kinds of problems everyone cared about and why. And yeah, so I think, we're all here because of Microsoft, and I actually think Microsoft has some really good models of doing this.
Oh, I mean, I'm glad to hear you say that, and I feel like that's been my experience here. We are about to open it up to.
Can I answer too?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry.
Oh, sure. No, complementing what's been said, everything I know about that and who to bring at the table, I know from friends, colleagues that really changed my mind. One thing that really resonates with me is, I worked with the School of Social Work, and my colleague, Dr. Patton, who started a summer school to help underserved communities that I'm working on right now, and help me, bring a lot of the social aspect of my work. He had, at the beginning, this clear message that you publish in each other's discipline. So you work together, you have a problem in common, but then you are accountable to both standards. And that is actually, unfortunately, not done enough. Like, we expect that, the progress on understanding the impact of AI, the impact of ML, is primarily discussed in the AI conferences, and this is where the majority of the translation to practice should be discussed and all of that. And that is, I couldn't dispute that more. This is a mistake. We are actually, I appreciate a lot the work of Microsoft Research and other industrial labs that have helped also on some problem put people together. But we have to be carefully right now investing in other discipline. It's super important. And that means, I hate to say it, but, some research institutes that sits a little bit in the middle of computational social science, sometimes with industry money, etc., are also taking money from foundation, are taking certainly a lot of space in very famous journal, in the press for sure, and put people who are the real discipline expert, lawyers, social workers, sociologists, in anthropologists, eat their lunch, and this is something where I think we need, as a discipline, to really be very careful about the side effect we have when we enter somewhere. So that's the first thing I want to share on, who should be at the table. I think we should be humbly at their table and accept that the impact of our work is going to be judged also by their community before anything. And for anything that truly is the biggest challenge, health, racial equity in deploying algorithm in social services, they are there anyway. They own, thankfully, the power is not just in the AI community, and we should be cherishing that we are sharing that power with those communities. So that should be really put forward. And I see that, but I see to not enough. I want to see that coming more often.
So Kevin, if I could, let me ask you to bring in some of the questions coming in from the audience, because they're really provocative. We have about 10 minutes. We're not, hopefully if we were at Redmond, we'd be spilling into the halls having some really good conversation. Sure. I encourage everybody to follow up and look up these scholars and reach out to them on Twitter or wherever they hang out. But Kevin, if you could just put some questions on the table for our panelists, and I'll ask the panelists to just go ahead and grab them as they come up.
Of course. So the first question from Eddie Cunningham is, why do you think the constraints, all those messy constraints that pop up when applying research to real-world problems, are not considered in the academic research world?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I feel like, Irene, you touched on this earlier, just talking about the things all that you have to do to identify the problem and in some ways reframe the problem. I'm wondering if you have some thoughts for Eddie Cunningham.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is that because we've centered algorithms and methodology, there's sort of this view that if your method is general and flexible, that's great, and that's what you should focus on. But when you get into the nitty-gritty of constraints, you have to move away from general methods and specify a specific problem that you care about. And then all of a sudden, when it becomes too specific, people are like, oh, this is not as impactful, right? And so I think that's one of the things that's coming in from the academic perspective that creates a disincentive for really considering the specific constraints of each problem that we are facing. Another issue often is that these are really hard to model. Like, what's the metric for equity of access? There are metrics for diversity out there, but then when we tried them, they weren't really very sensitive in what we were doing. And so should we come up with a new metric of diversity? These questions are really, really hard to answer. And frankly, I don't think we're equipped to answer them very well. And so I think as a field, at least in my area, we just sort of say, oh, we have this flexible framework. We'll let the policymaker decide what these should be. And then it's no longer part of our research.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. If I could, let's maybe try and get a couple more questions on the table, and if one person would grab it.
Yeah. So, go ahead. A follow-up to that question is, how do you think we change the incentives around these types of things in academia so that this messy, specific research is more valued?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
So how do we change the incentives in academia and in research so that these kind of messy, specific underground questions are more valued?
Yeah, and Augustine, I want to add a little frosting to that cake and ask you, sorry for the metaphors, that's not very useful. What's gotten in the way of tenured faculty valuing these approaches that, as Irene and Rediat have talked about, really have to do with redefining the problem and talking about power, talking about politics? Like what gets in the way for tenure? Why is that disincentive?
Yes, I think we have to address, the elephant in the room, that our field needs a massive effort to bring a more diverse talent pool and change the perspective from, a sort of neutral majority technology being sort of, a good thing whose application and consequence are to be discussed by other fields, and somehow the responsibility is in the end of, as you said, the regulator who decides the metric function of the diversity, and we are sort of truthful and selfless servants of a greater good. I think this is important to realize that and to see how when essentially assistant professor takes their time to build the bridges with affected community, with other disciplines, when they challenge also the questions that is being asked, as Rediat was saying, if you're working on what the for-profit machine that extract data and make money from it is going to operate, you're always going to find partners, you're always going to find fundings, and a sort of listening here in program committee and others, that this is an important problem. It's much harder, and we set an incredible bar for showing that a social good problem is worth addressing, and is going to be a major impact in the next few years. And so I think this is where I think the primary incentives would have to have somehow people who know about the domain judging whether the paper has a real potential for impact, as opposed to other computer scientists who are essentially sort of doing their second guess, and then sort of really limit the technical contribution to appreciate next to the potential impact. And that has been, a major problem. My current advice is for people who can't wait. You can do a PhD, but then do a startup or something like that. Because if you go on the academic, train, you're gonna have this tenure track, and maybe 10% of your energy could be going towards interdisciplinary and those questions behind. But people just expect you around the corner with, the usual kinds of realm, and you're gonna have to wait for tenure. After tenure, probably you have a chance. And so that's more or less, what I tell them. Also go in. You can go in if you don't mind that your research priorities are set up by profit companies. There are research labs that do intellectually very interesting stuff on a broad set of discipline, and that's kind of a little bit what's going on right now. I have to be frank. Long term.
Do you want me to jump in, Mary, or do you want me to jump in?
I want to say one thing. I'm taking co-moderator's prerogative here to say, for everyone listening who's tenured, who's writing tenure reviews right now, it is our responsibility to recognize work that is pushing the boundaries. Full stop.
Yeah.
Right? Because I think one of the biggest challenges I'm seeing with the students I work with is they are not given the time that's required, that Irene and Rediat have and certainly Augustine, your work does as well, that requires having to learn a specific space, a specific domain, and to engage domain experts, which is costly. It takes a lot of upfront time. It pays off down the road. And so if there's one thing I could just say to everyone listening who's reviewing tenure, it's on us to slow things down so students have the time they need to be able to do this kind of work, because it is incredibly time consuming. You have to actually talk to people. That's most of what my day job is. They don't show up, they're busy, they have other things to do, they're being very nice. So, I just wanted to put that out there. And I know that we have this, I want to make sure we get one more question in before we finish, because there's a really great one from somebody that Kevin called out.
Yeah, so Mohammed asked in the chat, it says, as a young researcher, how do we balance trying to shift the focus of ML or computer science research towards benefiting underserved groups or goals, while gaining credibility for ourselves in the field that often doesn't prioritize those objectives, especially as a historically underrepresented minority?
That's a very good question.
Yeah. So I did I cut you off? Do you want to?
No, yeah, that's a really good question. I very deeply empathize with whoever asked this. Whoever asked this, feel free to email me. I have many thoughts that's not going to go in 2 minutes, but I would say that, so like my second year of grad school, when I sort of realized what I wanted to do, which is what I'm doing now, I went to my advisor, a very wise person, folks on this panel know him. And I said, look, this is what I want to do. It's going to take up, I'm going to spend like a third of my time doing MD for SG stuff, a third of my time doing Black and AI stuff, which is another initiative that I co-organized. And, a third of my time doing research. I work very, very long hours, but, you can't create hours out of thin air, right? And I said, this is what I want to do. It's very important to me. Like, I just need to do it this way. And he was honest with me. I think he was very sort of like, okay, here are the sort of the risks in doing that, right? You should just know what you're getting into. But he was very encouraging, and he sort of like backed me up and sort of provided support when I asked for it and when I needed it. And it worked out. I'm really glad that it did. But even if it hadn't worked out, I think I would not have changed what I did. Like, it was very, very important to me because, like in my department, I was like the only Black person. When I entered, I was the first Black woman to graduate from my department. Like in our entire history, only the second Black person to graduate from my department. To go back to Augustine's point about the elephant in the room, the Computing Research Association, the CRA, does an annual survey every year where they survey like not all, but like the vast majority of departments in the U.S. and some in Canada, and they found that. Every year I look this up, it's like really sad. There's over 5,000 faculty, and of those, only 85 of them are Black. If you're looking at full professors, right, the people more likely to be writing your tenure letters, there's only 23 of them. 23 faculty are Black out of the thousands and thousands of faculty that we have in computer science departments and PhD granting computer science departments across the country, right? So these numbers are really, really terrible. But, the way I see it is that, like, if you kind of feel this like urge to really push the boundaries of what's considered machine learning and who it should be helping, that's as important as like the other stuff, if not more important. So do it. I mean, there's like some tactics that I could email you. They're like very mundane and boring, but I can email to you anyway. But to me, I felt like there just was no choice. I felt like I had to do it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so true for many people who invest in these questions. Irene, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something that Rediat mentioned, which I think is maybe more actionable if you're thinking about how to do this in your own PhD or academic trajectory, is to find, even though the system is not incentivized this way, there are people who care and people who are willing to help you navigate how to push against the system, to sort of protect you from the boundaries of the system. And so like finding an advisor who's willing to do this, in my case, finding a department as junior faculty who's willing to support me in doing this, and being really upfront with those conversations like Rediat was, and saying, this is what I really care about. What do you think? How can I do this? And if someone comes to you and says like, oh, actually the way to be successful is to focus on methodology, you can do that after tenure, then maybe that's a sign to you that, oh, this person may be a great advisor for someone else, but not for me, right? So I think really finding those support networks and also realizing that it is a risk and sort of understanding for yourself, am I willing to take on that risk?
No, I think that's so important. I think finding those networks who are not necessarily immediately in your home base is so valuable. I want to ask one more question because we have a little bit extra time that they're graciously offering us. So let me put this question on there. And Augustine, I know I just cut you off again. So from Jenny Chen, oftentimes an algorithm is criticized as unfair because its prediction distribution is different from the real world distribution, creating a feedback loop that exacerbates a type of bias. How do you decide when your algorithm should try to match the real world distribution or when it should try to change the status quo? It can't be both and.
Who's going there? Can I
I'm
get
curious if any of you have thoughts on that.
So I can speak a little bit to that. I think we face that problem all the time. This is where that grounding into an impact, into understanding things behind your model and your assumptions, this is where it becomes real. Because you will never, from the raw data, answer that question. That is the kind of question, just like the causal effect cannot be differentiated from observational data. You just can't. That's the same thing. It is a question of a higher order that requires you to justify in which case. So and the shape it takes, for instance, in some situation, you can show that, for instance, an algorithm that is not doing exactly what the prediction will do will actually improve another metric. So the typical example would be, if you have a bias, let's say, against women in your online recommendation system, that means that there are women whose profile or content on YouTube or other should be higher or more. And if you replace that bias, you're actually going to improve the metric. Of course, it's never as simple as this little trick, but you can eventually get there. So those are the kind of things that can guide a situation where the intervention goes in a direction that usually requires to talk with domain expert, to draw parallel with other cases of intervention, the only thing I have when that happens is to say the fact that you are facing that question is a good sign that you're getting to a point where first that means the method you have is relatively powerful because it has this possibility, and also you could use that in ways that with effort could be justified. So.
Irene, did you have a thought you wanted to add? I thought I saw in your face a comment.
Oh no, I just I was just thinking back to a conversation Reddit and I were part of earlier today about a lot of the time to really tackle these kinds of questions of what should the objective be, what is the appropriate notion of fairness, do we care about procedural fairness or outcome fairness? Like you just need to step back and be aware of the larger context and bring in other people who may be able to inform which of these metrics is more appropriate for your situation. Yeah.
What I love from what I've heard from all of you today is just how much domain expertise and in many ways bringing humility to the questions you could address are so core to the way you approach machine learning and computation, computer science generally. And, just on that last question, I can imagine you would all agree that we're always intervening, like that we are always either part of maintaining a status quo, which is its own kind of action, or we are creating the change we want to see in the world. So I hope that folks who gathered for this conversation today see that in the work you've done, particularly for the Mechanism Design for Social Good workshop, that it precisely sets on the table an argument for intervening, and in many ways to recognize that we're already doing something. So we might as well be explicit, cognizant, and humble, and engaged about it. So if we were in this room, I would be standing up and applauding you all. So I wish everybody watching could do that. So I hope people will do that in their own homes, because I certainly want to do that right now.
Congratulations to you.
But thank you so much. Thank you so much for participating in this conversation. And I know that I hope that people know how to reach out to you, because I learned so much from you. Yeah.
I was about to, follow up what Reddy had said. If any of those things seems like relevant, especially for students or junior researchers who are wondering where we can have actionable proposition, I'd be extremely happy to receive follow-up from that. Very important time. Thank you.
Me too.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you, Kevin.